are presenting. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first guide, Anita.
Shall I start, Isabel?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Well, thank you so much for everyone's time and thank you everyone for joining today. Um, and I'm actually very excited that I'm starting the session off. So I hope I take you to a fairly unique place, very far from where we are in the UK. In fact, to Japan, to the 1800s of Japan. So the work I'm sharing today is a work that actually hasn't, what I believe has not been on display at all in the gallery. Right now, it is only available to see in on our digital website. So hopefully this is something new to you. It's titled Hour of the Monkey by the artist Yutagawa Kunisada. And like I said, it was produced in the 1800s, in fact, in 1816. Just to describe a little bit what you're seeing here before I go into talking about this work. This is a print from a wood block print, and you see a lady who's basically wringing a towel. She is probably getting ready or having finished just taking a bath. And then in the corner, you also see two monks or two men. And then at the top, you see some Japanese poetry. Um, this is this falls into the genre of what we call the ukiyo art. Um, Maybe a lot of you may know this already. Basically, ukiyo art is a genre of Japanese art from the 17th to 19th century, the most popular at that time. Ukiyo, this name, actually translates into pictures of the floating world. So you can see it's quite a dreamy kind of a type of art. The themes are usually about history, folk tales, landscape, sometimes with a touch of the erotic. Um, and probably some of you know the most famous piece of ukiyo art, and it's The Great Waves of Kanagawa by the artist Hokusai. So I don't usually do this in talks, as in I don't usually refer to another art that I can actually, another piece of art that I can't actually show you. But at least in this part of the world, I feel that that image of the Great Waves is so well known that I assume at least a good portion of you have seen it. But we're obviously not talking about that today. Although this print falls into the same genre, it is a very different type of print, and by the artist Kunisada. In fact, actually, although we know Hokusai more today, Kunisada, the artist of this piece, was actually more commercially successful his time, and he was even more prolific. In fact, he created more than 20,000 pieces of works during his life. But because he was so commercial, some of them were very, very amazing. Some of them were not as much. So there's definitely a big, big range in terms of what he's produced. He often creates prints about that are images of women, beautiful women like this one, or of sumo wrestlers, or of actors. So they're very, very common topics for him and also for his time. Um, so far, I know Isabel earlier asked some of you to share something on the chat, and I would say it's a little bit quiet, but I'll make a second attempt. And so those of you who are comfortable with using the chat or who's okay with multitasking, I'm gonna throw out a question first and collect some answers while I continue talking about the work. As I mentioned earlier, this image is of a woman taking a bath. And some of you might already be asking the question, what is it that's hanging from her mouth? So there's a tie and then a red object that's hanging off her mouth. If any of you have guesses on what that red object is, please feel free to enter it in the chat. And like I said, I'll see if I collect any answers. Obviously, unfortunately, since we're online, I won't be able to sort of send you any gifts, but you definitely get bragging rights if you get it right. I'll continue talking while any of you make an attempt. As I mentioned earlier, this print I believe, has not actually been shown in the gallery at all on display. I had a very lucky chance to actually see it with one of our curators down in our stock. It turns out actually Manchester Art Gallery has more than 150 Japanese prints like these in our collection. So that's actually quite a sizable collection. And I got a chance to see this because I was actually helping our curator kind of figure out the Japanese poem that's written at the top. When I'm not leading tours in our gallery, I'm actually a writer, so I write poetry. So it's something of interest to me as well. So I see mouth covers, I see eye mask, face funnel, scrub mitt. So yeah, very close. What I'll say is actually when the curator and I first saw this image, we probably, having lived through COVID, both thought that was a mask. So yeah, eye mask, mouth cover, something similar to that. But it turns out it's actually not a mask at all. Turns out what she's holding in her mouth is called rice bran bag. What's inside is usually the powder form of the husk of rice or milled brown rice or soybeans, bran, and sometimes even some bird droppings, and I'll talk about that more, all in powder form. And it was actually that time in Japan that this became very popular to be used as a form of body wash, basically soap for that time. Like I said, it's made of rice, soybeans, bran, sometimes bird droppings. And they believe that this mixture of powder actually helps the skin maintain moisture or brighten your complexion and basically just clean, right? So to me, that was a really big surprise, especially because, and I'll share this sort of slight personal story. One of the very well-known Japanese skincare brands right now, called SK-II, it's the best-selling brand today, even in Japan, actually still uses rice for their base ingredient to improve your skin quality. So it turns out, something that they've been using from the period of this print, or even before that, that tradition has continued to today, and people have continued to kind of expand on this. And I mentioned earlier that one of the material that sometimes go into this mixture is actually a type of bird dropping. More specifically, it's the droppings of a type of droppings from a type of nightingale called Japanese bush warbler. I'm not so familiar with this bird. I just know it is a nightingale. But I just find it shocking that they would use these droppings. But it turns out they have found that, and it's scientifically proven that this dropping is contributing to brightening one's complexion. So it turns out it was very effective, and people in Japan today still sometimes would use this ingredient. Yeah, so just wanted to share this image with all of you, and hopefully with all the cold weather that we've been having in Manchester, when some of you maybe are taking a warm bath, this image might flow into your mind, and this type of powder might be similar to maybe the bath salts that you may be using. So thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you, Anita, and good evening, everyone. I thought I'd look at nativities today. It's a very sort of festive thing to look at. So here we have a very familiar nativity scene. We have the infant Jesus lying on some straw with his mother Mary kneeling and Saint Joseph on the left, his earthly father. And in the back, we have a donkey and an ox in a stall. And there are a couple of shepherds who've turned up to pay their respects. Now, the figure that's not normally in a nativity scene is the one behind Mary in the red, and this is Saint Bridget. She was a nun, and she's one of the six patron saints of Europe. And in 1370, she wrote a text about the nativity, and she described Mary after Jesus' birth. So she described her as worshipping him, with her head down and her hands clasped. And after this writing was made available, many artists used it as their template. And so Mary's usually shown in this attitude after the birth of Christ. Now, the painting is a predella panel, which means it's from the lower section of an altarpiece, and very probably from a church dedicated to St. Bridget. Now, I was looking at nativity scenes as opposed to paintings. We're very familiar with these, like in churches and shopping centres and in our homes. They're sort of seasonal displays and have sets of individual figures and props. And there's other characters like from the Holy Family, like shepherds, kings, angels, sheep, all that sort of thing. And these tended to have come from the Gospels, how all these different parts of the nativity scene come together. So like the donkey and the ox were mentioned in the St. Luke's Gospel, and the Magi, the kings and the camels came from Matthew's Gospel. And in several cultures, they still have the Holy Family, but they also have many other characters which may or may not be biblical. Now, the first living nativity scene was made by St. Francis of Assisi in 1223 in the Italian town of Greccio. Now, St. Francis had been to the Holy Land to see Jesus' birthplace and wanted to recreate it when he came back. So he built a manger in a cave near Greccio, and in it put a donkey and an ox. And there were no other figures, but the place was really used for contemplation and for worship. So the worshippers could go and imagine what it would have been like in Jesus' birthplace. So it was dramatic, but not sculptural. Now, the nativity scene as an art form can be traced back to the 18th century in Naples. And this showed life in Naples rather than Palestine. And the families there competed to have the most elegant and elaborate scenes they could find. So you had the Holy Family in the middle, and then next to them you had ladies and gentlemen nobility, vendors with miniature goods, cheese, bread, sheep, pigs, ducks, fortune tellers, card players, an entire town, entire village. They're just incredibly ornate and inventive. And in another, as I was researching this, and at the risk of lowering the tone of this whole proceedings, I will share with you a figure I found from the nativity scenes in Catalonia, Andorra and Valencia. And it's a Cagane, which translates as the pooper. This is a peasant wearing a red Catalan cap. He's got his trousers down and he's sort of relieving himself in the corner. Now, the origins are unknown, but the date dates from the late 17th, early 18th century, and is thought to be related to like the fertility of the ground and the soil and the harvest. He's a very popular figure of modern Catalan nativity scenes. Obviously, he's not front and centre next to the manger. He's really tucked away around the back, and children have the fun of trying to search for him. He's lurking at the back somewhere, so you have to sort of pick him out from this cast of thousands in this nativity scene. And just speaking of children, I'm sure we've all been to school nativity plays. I know I've sat through many in my time, and I just heard this story which I thought I'd share with you as it's Christmas. The nativity scene in a primary school, and the three little boys were being the kings, and they were taking up the presents, and they weren't quite sure what they were doing. So the first one turns up and says, "Here, gold," and the second one turns up and says, "Here, myrrh." And then the third one turns up a little unsure and says, "Here, Frank sent this." So you've got to give kids the due. They do just go for it when they're not sure. Anyway, thank you for your time tonight, and I'll hand over to Anne.
Thank you, Pauline. My nativity is slightly different, and it's genteel. Thank you. So every Christmas special, I fall in love with the work I've chosen. And this year's work is mesmerizing. It's old, 1504. It's tiny, the size of an A4 piece of paper, folded in half. Can you imagine that? But look at the detail. It's human, it's intricate, and it confirms Dürer as a Renaissance man, a businessman, a mathematician, an art theorist, and a naturalist. It's a black ink print produced from engraving. Dürer drew directly onto a copper plate using a scriber, S-C-R-I-B-E-R, and then gouged out using a burin, B-U-R-I-N. He saw the market potential of producing prints rather than totally relying on commissions. You'll see that the nativity figures take up only a fraction of the work. It's mainly architectural, and Dürer would have extensive knowledge of design and construction. Look at the masonry and the brickwork. Now, a dilapidated building was common in Northern Renaissance nativities. Christ was coming to redeem a dilapidated world. This was a new beginning, hence the vegetation sprouting from the ruins. The whole work is about change, from 15th century iconography to ventures into perspective, probably learned from Dürer's his extended visits to Venice. You can see that our eyes are drawn through a Romanesque arch to a rather quirky angel Gabriel, and shepherds and their sheep. Mary's kneeling in front of her child, arms crossed in a gesture of love and recognition of his divine status. But to signify his humanity, Christ is unclothed. I wish you could see it better. I've actually seen it in the flesh. But the detail in the representation of this child is staggering when you consider the scale of this work. But what I love about this work is Joseph. Can you see him in the middle foreground? He looks so sweet. He's quietly and determinedly getting on with drawing water from a well. This could allude to baptism and the unbroken pitcher he's holding, and well to Mary's purity. Joseph is often out of the limelight, getting on with things. By all accounts, he was very nice. Matthew 1 describes him as a just man. So it's lovely to see him twice. If you look beyond Mary, you see the same face worshipping Jesus, this time with a shepherd's crook. There's an ox and axe. Sorry, I knew I was going to say axe. There's an ox and ass behind him. As well as adding to the lowly nature of the surroundings, they allude to Isaiah chapter 1, which declares that the ox knows its owner and the ass knows its master's stall, but Christ's new home has no knowledge, no discernment. This is a prophecy that Christ will not be recognized by those in authority. Other symbolism includes the beams above Mary forming a cross. The half-timbered building may have once been an inn, and Dürer has placed his distinctive initials logo in the form of an inn sign an in sign at the top left of the work. I hope you can see it. He was the first artist to sign his work. Fine lines, close together for shadow, cross-hatching and dividing by horizontal and vertical lines make this work technically brilliant. But the very human nature of Mary and Joseph make it a work of genius. Thank you and Merry Christmas. Can I just say, please have a look at this work. Please Google it and you'll be able to see it in more detail. But now, over to you, John.
Well, thank you, Anne. A most intriguing work there. Well, we move forward now 150 years from the time of Albrecht Dürer. And the date is significant because 1653 is right slap bang in the middle of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, which affected much of Western Europe over a period of 3 centuries. And just to give you some idea of the intensity of this, between 1649 and 1664, the River Thames in London froze 4 times. Here, of course, we're in the Netherlands. We don't know quite where. The artist Jan van Goyen was from Leiden. Like many landscape artists, he trained in Haarlem, but by this point in his life, he was very much of The Hague. And it could be that the scene is from near there, or it might be some reimagined reality, a landscape of the imagination. But the important thing to grasp, of course, is that when we think of the River Thames freezing, we think of frost fairs. And we saw, or there were frost fairs in the Netherlands as well, and they were captured on many canvases. But this, of course, many of them, of course, have a celebratory feel, but this is far from celebratory. This is a scene of hardship, of an endurance. And of course, also, I think what is especially effective about this work is the bracing effect it has on us, especially at this time of year. We can almost feel the severity of the elements. And how does the artist achieve those things? Well, when he was working on this kind of somber theme, he was very careful about the way he prepared his paints, particularly his greys, his creams, his browns, and we can see very careful use of all of those. It's, by the way, it's not all on canvas. It's all on panel, which is the way it tended to work. We can see translucent passengers as well, which allows him to introduce sort of variations in the light. Indeed, we see little shafts of light. We say layered clouds. And in the clouds, you can actually make out, especially along the top, visible rapid brushstrokes, which makes some people think he was some sort of precursor to the Impressionists. And then just over towards the left and also center right, little tantalizing glimpses of blue, which perhaps give us reasons for hope. The thing about Jan van Goyen, he wasn't just an artist, he was a supremely gifted artist. There's no landscape artist, no question at all about that, with a huge range to his work. But he was also an incurable speculator and investor, to the extent that he lost a lot of money in property investment and land purchase. He also lost a lot of money in the greatest gamble of all from the entire history of the Dutch Republic, the tulip craze that, of course, burst in 1637. And how many of us have stood in Gallery 14 in front of some of those beautiful flower paintings? And we see often in the center of many of them, the Semper Augustus tulip, that very rare variety that caused so many people to invest and eventually lose a lot of money. And of course, it's there in such works as a reminder of folly. Well, Jan van Goyen was almost the embodiment of such folly. 3 years later, he died. He died in huge debt, which was then, of course, effectively bequeathed to his wife. She had to sell all his paintings, all of their property, and was still heavily in debt. So not much of a bequest to his wife, but to us, he bequeaths something else, an intriguing meditation on the uncertainties of the weather that speaks to our own age just as much as it did to his. And now on a completely different theme, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Joan. So Joan, over to you. We're not getting any sound, Joan, at this point.
Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm going to start it in 1823 at the opening of the Royal Manchester Institute of Art, Literature and Science. It had in its possession some sculptures which had been gifted to the art gallery by one Jonathan Hatfield. And a newspaper article of 1895 showed that on display in the entrance hall was a fine collection of statuary in keeping with the Institute and known as a temple to the arts. But after the Second World War, these sculptures disappeared, thought to have been destroyed or damaged. And by the 70s, the then director of the gallery, Timothy Clifford, in keeping with the art gallery's Greek revival style, wished to recreate this grand scheme of statuary at the entrance. But it wasn't until 1981 that Manchester Art Gallery, as it's now known, acquired other works of art. One of these works was entitled The Wrestlers, what we see here now. This sculpture had been gifted by Townley Hall, Burnley Borough Council, but unfortunately, there was no provenance attached to this sculpture, and further research is ongoing. Charles Townley, a very wealthy gentleman in the 18th century, had travelled to Italy at least 3 times, spending time in Rome and in Florence. At the moment, a list of the statuary he collected did not include this one, The Wrestlers. And it seems that Charles Townley never owned it anyway. So could our plaster cast, because it is a plaster cast, of The Wrestlers have been commissioned by him? It seems not, as documents from one of the Charles Townley's collections did not include this sculpture. So this very limited information of just one work of art brought to my mind the monumental task of curators and researchers to search for any scrap of information which would lead us to finding out more of the provenance of the hundreds of paintings and statuary in the art gallery's collection. Quite a lot of the collection was gifted also to the British Museum. Questions like who commissioned it, who was the artist, how did Townley Hall in Burnley itself acquire our sculpture? And my interest in this sculpture started a few weeks ago when I had been to the taking stock room, the out of the crate room. And I just love the detail, the muscular bodies of both men, so realistic, and had been carved absolutely beautifully. Ours is a plaster cast, as I've mentioned, and this was cast from a marble sculpture of one which is now in the Tribuna in the Uffizi Gallery, Florence. This particular work is a Roman copy in marble, though, of a now lost Greek sculpture of the 3rd century BC. Unfortunately, as I've said, there is very little information on our acquisition, or indeed the name of our sculpture of the wrestlers. Wrestling was a very popular ancient Greek sport at the time of the 3rd century BC, and it became an Olympic event. The aim of this sport was to try and force your opponent to fall on his abdomen or indeed his shoulders and pin down to the mat to the count of 3. To win, you had to score at least 2 out of 3 points. When looking at our sculpture, I might ask, who do we think is the stronger opponent? Their legs are intertwined. Certainly the uppermost body, his left leg is completely entwined into his opponent's right hip. And there is very little space between their bodies. The upper wrestler seems to have an advantage over his opponent, but this could be deceptive and would need to be looked at in the round. So we are now left waiting for more information, and until further research is carried out, the provenance of this particular sculpture, the wrestlers, will remain unsolved. Thank you. And I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Lindsay.
I think, are we going to, because Richard's managed to join us. So Richard, did you want to go before me?
Yeah, that's fine.
Terrific.
I'll pop in and then I'll hand over to you after I've finished.
Lovely. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Joan. Okay. Isabel, can you move on to the next image, please? Thank you. Right. Okay. So this is the image that I've chosen, or the piece that I've chosen. It's by a Portuguese artist called Joana Vasconcelos. Now, its title, when you look at it, you could misread it as Beastie. It's a horse's head, so you kind of would assume that's its title. But it's not. It's called Bestie. And there's a reason behind that, which we'll perhaps explore. But it's an unusual feature of this horse's head is that it's got a pattern all over it, which you wouldn't necessarily associate with horses. It's difficult to tell from the image whether it's a painted pattern or a printed pattern, but it's certainly a regular pattern. It's made of circles and swirls, and it seems to cover the whole of the horse's head. This item was actually acquired by the gallery in 2015 after a major exhibition by the artist Joana Vasconcelos of that year. Unfortunately, we don't have the facility to have such major exhibitions at the moment, but hopefully we will be looking in the future to do something of that sort. When we start finding out a bit about it, this is actually sort of more than one artwork. The actual head is a ceramic head. It's kind of life-size, horse life-size, and it's a ceramic head. Now, this head sculpture, this horse's head sculpture, was again by a Portuguese artist called Rafael Bordal Pinheiro, and he was a renowned Portuguese artist of the 19th century, and his factory is still producing ceramics. And this sculpture, when you see the sculpture without the adornment, is a pure white ceramic sculpture of a horse's head. But what Joana has done is overlaid this with crocheted lace. And bearing in mind that she's an artist from Portugal, she's used something which is it's crocheted lace, which is a product of Portuguese craftspeople. And it's very traditional in terms of its design and its technique. And it's principally made by women, and also these women are principally located in the Azores. So what Joanna has done, oh, we've just moved on to the next one. What Joanna has done is actually taken a rather masculine form of horse's head. Horse's head, often associated with military sculptures, statuary that's often have warriors sitting on the backs of horses, usually displaying dominance and power. What Joanna has done is actually subverted that image and overlaid it with a much more feminine design, a feminine artifact. And so what she's done is actually changed this sculpture and made, in a sense, by bringing two pieces of artwork together, the horse's head sculpture and the crochet, actually created this third piece, which is the combination of the two. And as I said, its title is Bestie. And I'll also mention the fact that this piece was acquired by the gallery following a major exhibition, and it was actually made for the gallery collection. And the name Bestie was chosen in tribute to that well-known Northern Irish footballer, George Best, who played for Manchester United in the 60s and 70s. So in many ways, it's a present to Manchester Art Gallery, and it's a present to Manchester, bearing the name of one of its significant footballing heroes. So now I'm going to hand over to Lindsay.
Thanks very much, Richard. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I've chosen to talk about Daniel Maclise's A Winter Night's Tale because of the way it depicts the timeless tradition of storytelling during the darkest days of the year. Maclise was born in Ireland in 1806 of a modest background, but his natural artistic talent took him to London, where he made his name as a history and portrait painter. A Winter Night's Tale was painted in 1867, near the end of the artist's life. At first it looks like a traditional painting of a domestic scene, and yet closer inspection reveals its careful construction and theatrical artifice. It is being described as a cottage interior of indeterminate period, although I would question the accuracy of cottage, as the furnishings and items look far too costly for that. Few cottages can boast a suit of armor, for example, which is seen at the back of the image. The description of indeterminate period is correct, however. The spinner's headdress looks almost medieval, but the couple to the left of her appear to be wearing Tudor headgear. And meanwhile, the hairstyles and silhouettes of the girls by the fire appear to be mid-Victorian, contemporary to the time of the actual painting. The artificiality of the scene continues in its composition, which resembles a stage set, the dramatic light from the fire casting its glow upon the storyteller. A screen has been set behind her, as if the characters within the painting orchestrated the theatricality of the event, creating a sort of stage within a stage. In this respect, the ahistorical clothing helps to emphasize the artificiality of the scene, recalling the improvised costuming of an amateur dramatic production. I particularly enjoy the visual pun of the storyteller, an actual spinster at her spindle. She is spinning a yarn both figuratively and literally. Her upright finger mirrors the fleece on the spindle, but can also be read as a sign of admonishment, as though she's telling a cautionary tale. Whatever she's saying, her listeners are rapt, and yet each reacts differently to her story. The two parental Tudor figures seem concerned and thoughtful. The girl on the far left glances anxiously into the shadows, while the young male figure on the bottom right has cast his own book onto his knee, the better to concentrate on the storytelling. The surrounding darkness lends itself to supernatural tales, and long before the tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas, midwinter and the longest night was seen as a time close to the spirit world. The half-drawn curtain at the window contributes to this sense of otherworldliness, allowing a pale light to enter from outside. Whether this is a cold winter sun or moonlight, we cannot be certain. There is a clock in the top right-hand corner whose minute hand stands at 12, but whose hour hand is indecipherable. Perhaps it's midnight, the witchiest of hours. Here and there are the symbols of Christmas, which we have borrowed from an earlier pagan tradition. There's greenery and mistletoe on the mantelpiece, greenery on the armor. The armor recalls to me the medieval legend of the Green Knight, a story which begins during the midwinter festivities at the court of King Arthur, and which also contains elements of the supernatural. At the time this painting was created, Dickens' Christmas Carol had been constantly in print since its publication over 20 years previously, and Maclise had a personal connection with Dickens. He had painted the author's portrait and had illustrated some of his books. And with this in mind, I've been puzzling over the item in the bottom right of the image, which appears to me almost to be a pair of crutches. Could this be an allusion to Dickens' Tiny Tim, perhaps, here happily grown to adulthood in the figure of the young man with the book? Or have I too succumbed to the enchantment of the flickering light and dark shadows to see images that are not there? Although the tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas may not have been introduced by Dickens, it was certainly popularized by him. The subtitle of A Christmas Carol is, of course, being a ghost story about Christmas. Maclise's atemporal depiction, however, suggests a much older tradition. And in fact, the inspiration for the painting was a line from Shakespeare's Richard II, the line which reads, "In winter's tedious nights, sit by the fire with good old folks and let them tell thee tale." And of course, the painting's title, A Winter Night's Tale, recalls Shakespeare's Winter's Tale. This painting was given to the gallery in 1908 by Enriqueta Rylands, whose name will be familiar to you from the John Rylands Library, which she had built following the death of her husband. By 1908, Maclise's ahistorical painting was itself out of step with the times. Picasso was well into his Cubist period by then, and Matisse's Fauvism was depicting interior scenes in a very different idiom. And yet, despite its internal anachronisms and outmoded artistry, the painting's theme is timeless, addressing a human need to gather together against the darkness and to look for a common light in shared stories. Thank you. And now it's my huge pleasure to hand over to my colleague Rita.
Thank you, Lindsay. So, good afternoon, good evening, my dear friends and friends of Manchester Art Gallery. As the holiday approaches, bring with it the warmth of family gatherings and the magic of cherished traditions, few symbols capture the spirit of Christmas quite like a doll's house. Mahboubeh Rajabi, an Iranian digital artist and creator, has reimagined the concept of a doll's house by putting one into an ancient suitcase. A charming and whimsical idea, isn't it? So the suitcase itself, vintage and weathered, adds an additional layer of character. Its leather corners, brass clasps, and faded label whisper tales of journeys past. When opened, the suitcase reveals a miniature world within, inviting us to pause, to marvel, to imagine the lives unfolding in its tiny rooms. This doll's house in a suitcase is both deeply personal and universally relatable story. Rajabi, who has experienced the challenges of displacement after the Green Revolution in Iran, created her doll house to reflect the poignant realities faced by refugees and migrants worldwide. Encased within an ordinary suitcase, the doll's house is an artistic representation of the notion of carrying your beloved home wherever life's journey leads. Indeed, this work goes beyond just the aesthetic. The suitcase itself serves as a powerful metaphor. For many displaced individuals, a suitcase is not just a travel accessory, but a vessel for all the remains of their life before. Rajabe's transformation of this utilitarian object into a new tiny world highlights the tension between loss and creation, impermanence and belonging. What do we carry with us from year to year, from day to day, from one place to the other? Beyond physical possessions, we have our emotional and cultural memories, our close people, our pets, all that defines home, which we can always metaphorically put in a small suitcase and take with us whenever and wherever. During this Christmas holiday season, Rajabe's Doll's House in a Suitcase reminds us to reflect on the true meaning of home and the privilege of stability. It invites us to extend compassion to those who are journeying through life with their homes carried in their hearts and suitcases. It reminds us that home is not just a place, but a feeling, one that can be recreated and carried even in the smallest of spaces. The suitcase reflects the journeys we make to return to loved ones during the holidays. It symbolizes the bittersweet experience of those who carry memories of a distant home, blending the old and the new. In this house, tiny characters should live in rooms with beautiful furniture, lights on, music playing, Sansoon fabrics and delicate decorations. They should bring in the miniature rooms to life and to make a house a home. But alas, this particular doll's house was empty and cold. However, miracles always happen at Christmas. So we decided to add some joyful magic lights, life and decorations to this house. Much like the spirit of Christmas transforms simple traditions into moments of wonder, the suitcase with the dollhouse turns an everyday object into a realm of imagination. It brings together past and present, creativity and memory, and invites us to carry a little piece of home wherever we go. This work was presented by author in 2 versions with different doll's houses. So the first one you saw a moment ago, and the second house you see now decorated, just for to put some magic to this meeting. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Oh, thank